the Wild West, a term that evokes images of vast open plains, rugged mountains, and a world of boundless opportunity. It was an era that defined a nation, a time when the untamed frontier tested the limits of human courage and resilience. During the 19th century, America embarked on its great westward expansion, a journey fueled by dreams of prosperity and a belief in manifest destiny. The frontier offered freedom, but came at a cost. With no established law and order, the Wild West earned its name as a land of outlaws and vigilantes, where justice was often served at the barrel of a gun. But the Wild West was more than its chaos. It was a melting pot of cultures, Native Americans, immigrants, and settlers, all vying for a place in this untamed land. While many were drawn by the lure of gold and riches, others sought new beginnings, hoping to carve out a life through hard work and perseverance. The cowboys, with their cattle drives and rugged independence, became icons of the West. Yet, the story was not all romantic. The westward push displaced Native American tribes, led to violent conflicts, and forever altered the lives of countless people. Despite these complexities, the Wild West lives on in our collective memory, immortalized by legends and tales of heroism and adventure. It represents both the best and worst of human ambition, a symbol of opportunity, resilience, and the enduring spirit to conquer the unknown. As we reflect on this chapter of history, let us remember its lessons. The Wild West reminds us that with great ambition comes great responsibility, and that progress must always consider the voices of those it impacts. The Wild West holds a unique place in history and the collective imagination of people worldwide. It was a time unlike any other, a period when uncharted territories beckoned the brave, the adventurous, and the restless. This era, often romanticized in books, films, and folklore, is remembered for its spirit of freedom, rugged landscapes, and unyielding human determination. Yet, beneath the surface of this mystique lies a complex and often contradictory reality. The Wild West wasn't just about cowboys and shootouts at high noon. It was a transformative period that reshaped nations and cultures. It was the land of opportunity for some, where people dreamed of escaping poverty and building better lives. For others, it was a battleground, a place where survival demanded ingenuity, grit, and a willingness to endure hardships unimaginable to us today. The fascination with the Wild West endures because it embodies both the promise and peril of human ambition. It represents the relentless pursuit of progress, the challenges of adapting to untamed environments, and the rich tapestry of stories that emerge from encounters between different cultures and communities. The Wild West is not just a chapter of history. It's a symbol of resilience, risk, and the enduring human desire to explore the unknown. Let us delve deeper into this extraordinary era, uncovering the layers of history, myth, and legacy that define the Wild West. The era of westward expansion was one of the most transformative periods in American history, driven by a vision of growth, opportunity, and the belief in manifest destiny. The idea that the United States was destined to expand its territory across the entire North American continent. This period, which began in the early 19th century and spanned several decades, was marked by unprecedented migration and a reshaping of the nation's geography, economy, and social structure. For settlers, the allure of the West was undeniable. It promised fertile farmland, open spaces, and the potential for new beginnings. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and subsequent territorial acquisitions, such as the annexation of Texas, the Oregon Trail migrations, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, significantly expanded the nation's boundaries. These milestones opened vast swathes of land to exploration, settlement, and cultivation, and for many, the West became synonymous with opportunity and independence. However, this expansion was not without its challenges and consequences. The journeys themselves were grueling. Families loaded their belongings into covered wagons and traversed thousands of miles through treacherous terrain, battling harsh weather, scarce resources, and disease. Despite these hardships, they pressed on, driven by the hope of a brighter future. Entire communities uprooted their lives in pursuit of this dream, creating settlements that would eventually grow into bustling towns and cities. Westward expansion also brought about significant changes in industry and infrastructure. Railroads, such as the iconic Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, played a crucial role in connecting the East and the West, facilitating trade, communication, and the movement of people. New technologies, such as improved agricultural equipment, allowed settlers to cultivate the land more effectively, transforming the American economy and fueling the country's rapid industrial growth. Yet, this era of expansion was not a universally positive story. For Native American tribes, whose lands and way of life were disrupted by the encroachment of settlers, it was a time of profound loss. Treaties were often broken, and conflicts arose as tribes were forcibly removed from their ancestral territories, culminating in tragic events like the Trail of Tears and the displacement caused by the Indian Removal Act of 1830. These darker aspects of westward expansion serve as sobering reminders of the human cost of progress and ambition. The era of westward expansion was a defining chapter in the story of the Wild West. It reflected the duality of human endeavor, the unyielding drive for progress and opportunity, tempered by the complexities and conflicts that arose from transforming a vast, untamed frontier into a new home. The Wild West was defined by its raw, untamed frontier, a land of rugged landscapes that tested the resolve of anyone daring enough to venture into its vast expanses. From the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the sweeping deserts of the Southwest, the West was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. These untamed environments shaped the lives and challenges of settlers, cowboys, miners, and indigenous peoples, creating a backdrop for some of the most enduring stories of human endurance and determination. The land itself was both a blessing and a curse. For settlers, it offered a chance to claim something of their own, wide open spaces where they could build homes, farms, and towns. However, the reality of living in such an environment was far from idyllic. The arid plains, harsh winters, and scorching summers demanded resourcefulness and resilience. Farming was difficult, with settlers often struggling to adapt to unfamiliar soil conditions and unpredictable weather. Droughts, floods, and pests wreaked havoc on crops, while wild animals posed constant threats to livestock and families alike. Beyond agriculture, the sheer remoteness of the frontier added another layer of difficulty. Supplies were scarce, and settlements were often isolated, leaving pioneers to rely on their own ingenuity for survival. Small communities had to band together, pooling resources and labor to overcome the challenges of daily life. It was a life of hard work and uncertainty, where survival itself was an accomplishment. For many, the untamed frontier also represented danger. The rugged terrain made travel perilous, with travelers often facing broken wagons, exhausted animals, or even fatal accidents on treacherous trails. Diseases like cholera and dysentery were rampant among those making the journey westward, and medical help was often non-existent. Add to that the possibility of conflicts with wildlife or with other groups competing for resources, and it became clear that the frontier was not for the faint of heart. Yet, the untamed frontier also offered extraordinary opportunities. It was a place where individuals could reinvent themselves, escaping the rigid social hierarchies of the East. The promise of owning land, discovering gold, or simply starting anew drove countless people to take incredible risks in pursuit of their dreams. Even though the realities of life on the frontier were far harsher than most expected, the spirit of perseverance was a defining characteristic of those who dared to settle in the Wild West. The landscapes of the West were not just physical challenges. They were symbolic. They represented the unknown, the wild, and the unclaimed. For settlers, conquering the land meant more than just surviving. It was about taming something untouchable, shaping the wilderness into a place of human habitation and progress. One of the defining features of the Wild West was its lawlessness, a characteristic that earned the region its infamous reputation as a land where chaos reigned, and survival often depended on one's ability to navigate a world without clear rules. The vast and remote nature of the frontier made it nearly impossible for traditional systems of governance and law enforcement to establish a strong foothold. As settlers pushed westward, they often found themselves in isolated areas, far removed from the reach of established authorities. This absence of law and order created a vacuum that allowed crime, violence, and conflict to flourish. The vast distances between settlements and the lack of communication infrastructure made it difficult for any centralized government to enforce laws effectively. Towns sprang up overnight, especially during gold rushes or the expansion of railroads, often growing faster than local authorities could respond. In many cases, there were no sheriffs, judges, or courts to keep the peace. As a result, disputes over land, cattle, resources, and even personal grievances frequently escalated into violent confrontations. Gunfights, brawls, and theft became a part of daily life in many frontier towns, earning the Wild West its notorious reputation. This environment of lawlessness also gave rise to some of history's most infamous outlaws. Figures like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy became legends, their exploits romanticized in stories and folklore. These individuals operated outside the bounds of the law, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches, and evading capture in the vast, open landscape of the frontier. While many viewed them as dangerous criminals, others saw them as symbols of rebellion and resistance to authority, further adding to the mythos of the Wild West. In the absence of formal law enforcement, communities often took matters into their own hands, leading to the rise of vigilante justice. Vigilante groups were formed to combat crime and impose order where official structures were lacking. While these groups were sometimes effective in dealing with immediate threats, they were far from impartial. Accusations were often based on hearsay, and punishments were swift and brutal, ranging from public floggings to hangings. This form of justice, though necessary in some cases, often blurred the line between right and wrong, as mob rule replaced due process. The lack of law and order also created opportunities for power struggles and corruption. Some individuals or groups sought to exploit the chaos for personal gain, establishing dominance over towns or regions. These power dynamics often led to further violence, as rival factions vied for control. For example, cattle rustling and range wars, such as the infamous Lincoln County War, erupted over disputes regarding land, water rights, and livestock, leading to bloodshed and prolonged feuds. Despite its dangers, the lawlessness of the Wild West also contributed to its allure. The idea of a place where individuals could live by their own rules, unbound by societal constraints, captured the imagination of many. This freedom, though fraught with risks, was a defining aspect of the frontier experience, shaping the identity of the West and leaving a lasting legacy in American culture. The Wild West was far from a monolithic society. It was a vast and diverse region where people from different cultural, ethnic, and social backgrounds converged, each contributing to the unique fabric of the frontier. This blending of cultures shaped not only the history of the West, but also its enduring identity as a land of opportunity and challenge. The first inhabitants of the West were Native American tribes who had lived on the land for centuries, each with their own distinct cultures, traditions, and ways of life. Tribes such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and Navajo had developed deep connections to the land, adapting to its varying climates and terrains. They were hunters, gatherers, farmers, and warriors, and their societies were as rich and complex as any in the world. However, the arrival of settlers brought immense disruption to their way of life. Native American tribes were forced to confront the encroachment of settlers on their ancestral lands, leading to conflicts, displacement, and devastating losses. The westward expansion also drew large numbers of immigrants from around the world. Chinese laborers played a crucial role in building the Transcontinental Railroad, enduring dangerous working conditions and discrimination. Mexican Americans, many of whom had lived in the region long before it became part of the United States, contributed to the agricultural and ranching industries while maintaining their vibrant cultural traditions. African Americans, including freed slaves and buffalo soldiers, sought new opportunities in the West, hoping to escape the oppression of the South. European immigrants, particularly Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians, also settled in the West, bringing with them farming techniques, craftsmanship, and cultural traditions that influenced the communities they built. Each group brought its own skills, customs, and traditions, adding to the diversity of the frontier. In some areas, this diversity led to cooperation and cultural exchange. For example, ranching techniques in the West often drew heavily from Mexican vaquero traditions, including the use of lassos, saddles, and cattle driving practices. Similarly, Native American knowledge of the land and its resources often proved invaluable to settlers trying to survive in the harsh environment. In mining towns, cultural festivals and gatherings became opportunities for communities to celebrate their heritage, even as they worked side by side in pursuit of a better life. However, this cultural diversity was not without its tensions. Racial and ethnic discrimination was a harsh reality in many parts of the West. Chinese laborers faced intense prejudice, including exclusionary laws and violent attacks. Native Americans were systematically removed from their lands, and African Americans often encountered barriers to full participation in frontier life. Conflicts between groups over land, resources, and cultural differences were common, reflecting the struggles that often accompany rapid social change and integration. Despite these challenges, the cultural diversity of the Wild West left an indelible mark on the region's history. The blending of traditions, languages, and ideas created a unique frontier culture that still resonates today. From cowboy songs influenced by Mexican ballads to the architecture of Western towns inspired by European designs, the Wild West was shaped by the contributions of all its inhabitants. This diversity not only enriched the West, but also underscored the complexities of building a new society in a land of opportunity and adversity. The gold rush of the 19th century was one of the most significant events in the history of the Wild West, sparking a wave of migration that dramatically altered the social, economic, and political landscape of the region. It was an era defined by the discovery of gold in seemingly untapped territories and the feverish scramble of prospectors, miners, and entrepreneurs who rushed to claim their fortune. While the gold rush was often seen as an opportunity to strike it rich, it also came with countless challenges and hardships, revealing the complex dynamics of human ambition and the cost of pursuing wealth. The first major gold discovery that set off a rush to the West was in North Carolina in the late 1820s. But the most famous and impactful gold rush was the California Gold Rush of 1848. When James W. Marshall struck gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California, the news spread rapidly, igniting a frenzy of hopeful miners who flocked to the region in search of their fortune. Within months, tens of thousands of people from across the United States and around the world, particularly from Mexico, China, and Europe, poured into California, creating a population explosion that transformed the state from a sparsely inhabited frontier into a booming center of activity. The gold rush brought many people with dreams of wealth, but it also attracted a range of individuals with different motivations. Some came as miners, equipped with pickaxes and pans, determined to dig for gold in the rivers and hills. Others, seeing the growing demand for goods and services, sought to capitalize on the influx of people by opening businesses, selling supplies, food, and even entertainment to the miners. Merchants, bankers, and even gamblers descended upon the mining camps, hoping to profit from the boom. The influx of people during the gold rush also brought with it a mixture of cultures and social classes. There were miners from every conceivable background: farmers, soldiers, sailors, immigrants, and even women seeking a fresh start in a rapidly changing environment. It was a time of unprecedented opportunity, but it also exposed the harsh realities of frontier life. While some struck it rich, most miners found the task of extracting gold to be far more difficult than they had imagined. The physical labor was grueling, the conditions were hazardous, and the odds of finding significant amounts of gold were slim. Many miners, exhausted and disillusioned, ended up with little more than the debts they had incurred in the pursuit of riches. Yet the gold rush was more than just a story of personal ambition. It was a catalyst for broader social and economic change. The sudden population boom led to the creation of towns and cities, some of which, like San Francisco, grew from tiny settlements to major metropolitan areas almost overnight. New industries developed, such as transportation and communication networks, to support the growing population. The demand for goods and services helped fuel an economic boom, while the establishment of law enforcement and governance became necessary to maintain order amidst the chaos of prospecting camps. At the same time, the gold rush had significant negative consequences. The environment of the West was profoundly affected by the mining techniques employed, which caused extensive damage to rivers, forests, and land. Hydraulic mining, for example, involved blasting entire hillsides with water to expose gold veins, which led to soil erosion and contamination of water sources. Native American populations were displaced from their ancestral lands as settlers and miners expanded their reach, further exacerbating the already strained relations between indigenous peoples and the U.S. government. Additionally, Chinese immigrants who came to California during the gold rush were met with discrimination, and their contributions were often overlooked in favor of the narrative of the white American settler. Despite the challenges and inequalities that came with it, the gold rush left an indelible mark on the American West. It accelerated the process of statehood for California, which was admitted to the Union in 1850 and contributed to the expansion of railroads, communication networks, and industries that would shape the nation in the years to come. The gold rush is often remembered as a defining moment of the Wild West, not only because of the prospect of wealth it promised, but because of the way it encapsulated the risks, rewards, and realities of pursuing fortune on the frontier. The rush for gold reflected the broader themes of the Wild West, the quest for opportunity, the risks of ambition, and the transformative power of migration and exploration. The image of the cowboy is perhaps the most iconic symbol of the American West, embodying the rugged independence, hard-working spirit, and adventurous nature that defined the frontier. While the cowboy lifestyle is often romanticized in popular culture, it represents a complex and multifaceted way of life that was integral to the development of the Wild West. The rise of the cowboy and ranching industry not only contributed to the economic success of the region, but also shaped its cultural identity, influencing everything from folklore to fashion and even the political landscape. The cowboy's role in the Wild West began with the practice of cattle ranching, which was first introduced by Spanish settlers in the late 1600s. As Spanish settlers established missions in California, Texas, and other parts of the Southwest, they brought with them cattle and developed ranching techniques that would become the foundation for the cowboy lifestyle. These early ranchers, known as vaqueros, were skilled horsemen who managed vast herds of cattle, often in remote and harsh environments. They relied on a set of techniques and tools, such as the lasso, the saddle, and the spurs, that were passed down through generations and would later be adopted by American cowboys. As the American frontier expanded, the demand for beef grew, particularly in eastern cities and mining camps. With the development of railroads in the mid-1800s, cattle could be transported to distant markets, making the ranching industry more profitable. This led to the rise of large cattle ranches and the need for cowboys to manage herds that could number in the thousands. The cowboy's job was physically demanding and dangerous. They spent long hours on horseback, riding the range to herd cattle, repair fences, and manage the land. It was a life characterized by solitude, hard work, and an unshakable connection to the land and the animals they tended. The cowboy also played a crucial role in the iconic cattle drives, which became an emblem of the American West. These treks, often lasting several months, involved driving cattle from ranches in Texas to railheads in Kansas, where the animals would be shipped to slaughterhouses or markets in the East. The most famous of these cattle trails was the Chisholm Trail, which stretched from Texas to Abilene, Kansas. Along the way, cowboys faced numerous challenges, ranging from harsh weather and rough terrain to stampedes, illness, and conflicts with Native American tribes or other settlers. Despite these hardships, cattle drives were a vital part of the economic engine of the West, supplying beef to rapidly growing cities and towns across the country. While cowboys were essential to the cattle industry, their lifestyle was not without its challenges and contradictions. The cowboy image that is so widely recognized today was often shaped by the realities of the job, which involved far more than just riding horses and herding cattle. Cowboys had to be skilled in a variety of trades. They were blacksmiths, veterinarians, and carpenters, often having to repair their own equipment or tend to sick animals in the absence of professionals. They also had to navigate the social and political complexities of the time. For example, cowboys were often involved in conflicts over land and water rights, particularly as settlers encroached on open ranges or claimed land for farming. The life of a cowboy was not as glamorous as many might think. They often lived in isolated conditions, with little to no contact with other people for weeks or months at a time. Many cowboys were young men, often in their teens or early 20s, seeking adventure or escaping difficult circumstances. They came from all walks of life. Many were former soldiers, former slaves, or immigrants from Mexico, Europe, and even China, each contributing to the diversity of the cowboy tradition. These men, regardless of their background, shared a deep bond with the land and a hard-earned respect for the animals they tended. Ranching itself was not limited to cattle. Sheep, horses, and other livestock were also raised, contributing to the agricultural economy of the West. Ranchers and farmers worked together to establish the foundations for communities, many of which would become the towns and cities of the American West. Despite the efforts of settlers to establish order and tame the land, the presence of vast open ranges meant that ranching often had to adapt to shifting conditions, such as changing weather patterns, droughts, and the encroachment of railroads or mining operations. In the larger cultural context, the cowboy became a symbol of the frontier spirit, a figure embodying freedom, independence, and self-reliance. This image was perpetuated in literature, theater, and later, Hollywood films, where cowboys were depicted as heroes who tamed the wilderness and fought for justice. Over time, however, the cowboy's role in society evolved with the rise of corporate ranching and the introduction of barbed wire and more efficient agricultural practices, changing the face of ranching in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Nevertheless, the cowboy's legacy continues to be celebrated in the cultural memory of the American West. Rodeos, country music, and Western films all trace their roots back to the cowboy tradition. The cowboy's distinctive style, characterized by hats, boots, and spurs, has become synonymous with the rugged individualism of the West, even as the actual practices of ranching and cattle driving have evolved. Through the cowboy and ranching culture, the Wild West left an indelible mark on the American consciousness, shaping the narrative of the frontier as a place where hard work, perseverance, and a connection to the land defined a generation of pioneers. The construction of the railroad in the 19th century was a transformative achievement that not only changed the face of the American West, but also played a crucial role in the development of the nation as a whole. The advent of the railroad allowed for the rapid movement of people, goods, and ideas, connecting the far-flung corners of the United States in ways that were previously unimaginable. While the Transcontinental Railroad is often heralded as the key to the economic prosperity of the West, its impact went far beyond trade and transportation, touching nearly every aspect of life in the Wild West and reshaping the social, political, and cultural fabric of the time. Before the railroad, travel across the vast expanse of the West was a slow, arduous process, whether by wagon, horseback, or on foot. For settlers, this meant facing long, dangerous journeys across rough terrain, where roads were often non-existent and resources scarce. The journey west was time-consuming, taking months to complete, and many faced death from disease, accidents, or attacks along the way. However, the promise of the railroad changed all that, offering a more efficient and safer alternative to the perilous trek across the frontier. The idea of building a railroad that could span the entire continent was born out of the ambition to connect the East and West economically, politically, and socially. In 1862, the Pacific Railway Act was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln, authorizing the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. This monumental project was entrusted to two companies, the Central Pacific Railroad, working eastward from California, and the Union Pacific Railroad, working westward from Nebraska. The two companies would eventually meet at Promontory Summit in Utah, where they completed the railroad in 1869, joining the country from coast to coast. The construction of the railroad was a remarkable feat of engineering, involving the labor of thousands of workers, many of whom were immigrants. The Central Pacific employed thousands of Chinese laborers who worked under grueling conditions, digging tunnels through mountains, laying tracks across deserts, and building trestle bridges over rivers and canyons. On the Union Pacific side, Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans played a key role in constructing the line. These workers faced tremendous hardships, from dangerous working conditions to violent clashes with Native American tribes, who often viewed the railroad as an invasion of their lands. Despite the dangers and the grueling work, the completion of the railroad was a defining moment in American history. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Wild West was no longer isolated from the rest of the country. For the first time, people could travel quickly and relatively safely from the East Coast to the West Coast, with the journey taking just about a week instead of several months. This newfound speed and accessibility opened up a world of opportunities for settlers, entrepreneurs, and investors. Towns and cities sprang up along the railroad routes, as people flocked to areas that were now accessible for the first time. New industries emerged, including agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, fueled by the ease with which goods could now be transported to distant markets. The railroad was integral to the expansion of the economy in the West, allowing for the rapid distribution of resources like cattle, grain, and timber to national and international markets. In addition to spurring economic growth, the railroad played a pivotal role in the social and cultural transformation of the West. It encouraged migration by making the region more accessible to settlers from the East, as well as immigrants from Europe and Asia, who were seeking new opportunities. The railroad facilitated the movement of people in unprecedented numbers, contributing to the rapid population growth of frontier towns and cities. As a result, social institutions such as schools, churches, and businesses began to take root in areas that had once been little more than isolated outposts. The railroad also had a profound effect on Native American communities. The construction and expansion of the railroad disrupted traditional Native American ways of life, particularly for the tribes of the Great Plains. The railroad facilitated the movement of settlers onto native lands, further encroaching on their hunting grounds and sacred sites. In addition, the railroads were often used to transport military supplies and troops, which contributed to the forced removal of Native American tribes from their lands and the eventual destruction of their cultures. The impact of the railroad on indigenous communities was a painful and often tragic chapter in the history of the American West, as it accelerated the loss of their ancestral territories and resources. On the other hand, the railroad also provided a means of connecting the isolated frontier to the broader world, bringing new ideas, cultures, and technologies to the West. It facilitated the exchange of goods and knowledge, helping to transform the region into a more integrated part of the United States. It also played a crucial role in the development of the American economy, contributing to the rise of the industrial age by providing a means of transporting raw materials to factories and finished products to consumers. The railroad's impact on the West extended far beyond its physical infrastructure. It reshaped the entire social and cultural landscape of the region, changing the way people lived, worked, and interacted with each other. It brought people from all corners of the world to the West, creating a melting pot of cultures, ideas, and traditions. It also opened up vast expanses of land to settlement and exploitation, creating new opportunities but also sparking conflicts and tensions with indigenous peoples. In many ways, the railroad symbolized the triumph of human ingenuity and ambition, as well as the complex and often painful consequences of progress. Its legacy is woven into the fabric of the Wild West, a lasting reminder of the transformative power of technology and the far-reaching consequences of expansion. The history of the American West cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the profound and tragic impact that westward expansion had on Native American communities. For centuries before European settlers arrived, the lands of the West had been home to a diverse array of indigenous peoples, each with their own cultures, traditions, and ways of life. These societies had developed deep, spiritual connections to the land and its resources, often organizing their lives around the seasonal movements of animals, agricultural cycles, and sacred spaces. However, as settlers and the U.S. government pushed westward in the 19th century, they encountered fierce resistance from native tribes and ultimately subjected them to forced displacement, broken treaties, and violence that would decimate indigenous populations and cultures for generations. The displacement of Native Americans was a direct result of the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the North American continent. This ideology held that it was the nation's destiny and duty to spread its political, economic, and religious systems across the land, regardless of the indigenous peoples already residing there. As settlers moved westward, they claimed vast swaths of land that had been occupied by Native American tribes for thousands of years. In many cases, these settlers encroached on lands that were not only vital for the tribe's physical survival, but also central to their spiritual beliefs and cultural practices. As the United States government encouraged settlement and expansion, it imposed policies aimed at assimilating or removing native peoples from their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is one of the most infamous examples of these policies. Signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, it authorized the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their homelands in the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River, which was seen as uninhabited land. The Cherokee Nation's journey along the Trail of Tears became the most notorious example of this forced relocation, during which thousands of Native Americans died due to disease, starvation, and exposure as they were marched to reservations. When settlers moved further west, similar policies were implemented to remove indigenous populations from the Great Plains, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. The arrival of railroads, mining operations, and ranching expanded the pressure on native lands, further displacing tribes and disrupting their traditional ways of life. The U.S. government often responded to native resistance with military force, leading to violent confrontations such as the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, in which the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated General George Armstrong Custer's troops. Despite this victory, the increasing power of the U.S. military and the relentless push of settlers continued to erode native sovereignty. The forced relocation and displacement of Native American tribes were not limited to physical removal from their lands. The imposition of reservations was a system designed to control and isolate indigenous populations, forcing them onto small, often barren parcels of land where they were expected to adopt European-style farming and abandon their nomadic traditions. The reservations, which were often situated on land that was considered undesirable by settlers, created severe hardship for many tribes. Resources were scarce, and the federal government frequently failed to provide adequate support or food, leading to widespread poverty and malnutrition. Cultural assimilation was another key element of the government's strategy to undermine native sovereignty. Beginning in the late 19th century, native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were stripped of their native languages, customs, and spiritual practices. The goal of these institutions was to civilize Native Americans by erasing their identities and teaching them to adopt European American values and lifestyles. This policy of cultural genocide resulted in the loss of languages, traditions, and a sense of cultural continuity for many Native communities, some of which continue to struggle to reclaim and preserve their heritage. In addition to the physical and cultural displacement, the economic impacts of westward expansion on Native American tribes were devastating. The arrival of settlers disrupted traditional hunting and agricultural practices. The buffalo, which had been a central part of many Native people's diet and way of life, was systematically hunted to near extinction by both settlers and the U.S. Army, making it even harder for Native tribes to sustain themselves. The destruction of these vital resources, combined with the theft of land, placed immense pressure on Native communities, who were already struggling to survive in the face of a rapidly changing environment. The consequences of this displacement were not only immediate, but also long-lasting. Native American populations declined drastically in the 19th century, due to a combination of disease, starvation, violence, and the breakdown of traditional social structures. Diseases such as smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, spread rapidly among indigenous communities, decimating populations. By the end of the 1800s, many tribes had been reduced to a fraction of their former numbers, and their cultures were on the brink of extinction. The legacy of indigenous displacement is still felt today. Native American communities continue to face significant challenges, including poverty, poor health care, and limited access to education. Native lands are often fraught with environmental degradation, and many tribes continue to fight for the restoration of land rights that were taken from them. Despite these challenges, Native American communities have also shown incredible resilience. Many tribes have worked to reclaim their cultural heritage, revitalizing languages, traditions, and spiritual practices that were once on the verge of disappearing. Native sovereignty movements have gained traction in recent decades, with tribes seeking greater autonomy, legal recognition, and the return of ancestral lands. The story of Native American displacement in the Wild West is a sobering chapter in the history of the United States, a history marked by injustice, violence, and broken promises. However, it is also a story of resistance and survival. The Native American peoples of the West, though their cultures were ravaged and their lands taken, continue to fight for their rights, honor their traditions, and contribute to the diverse mosaic of the American nation. The memory of their displacement serves as an enduring reminder of the costs of westward expansion and the need to acknowledge and address the legacies of colonialism and injustice. The Wild West is often romanticized as a land of freedom and opportunity, where pioneers and settlers built new lives in the vast, untamed frontier. Yet beneath this adventurous spirit lay a deep-seated struggle for order and control. The absence of established law and governance in many areas of the West made the region notorious for lawlessness and violence. This chaos created fertile ground for vigilantism, as individuals and groups took justice into their own hands in the absence of formal legal structures. The complexities of this lawlessness, the formation of outlaw gangs, and the emergence of local heroes or infamous criminals all shaped the culture of the Wild West and have since become central to its mythos. In the early days of westward expansion, the rule of law was nearly non-existent in many areas of the frontier. As settlers moved westward, they often found themselves far from any established government, legal institutions, or law enforcement agencies. Towns and settlements sprang up overnight, sometimes populated by hundreds of people, but without the infrastructure to maintain order. The lack of a police force, courts, or even consistent communication with distant state or federal governments made it incredibly difficult to address disputes, enforce property rights, or protect individuals from criminal activity. In many cases, people had to rely on their own resources to survive and protect their homes, which contributed to a culture of self-reliance that sometimes took violent forms. This lack of formal law enforcement created the perfect breeding ground for criminal activity. Outlaws, bandits, and cattle rustlers became a common sight in many parts of the West. These criminals, often operating in small groups, would raid settlements, rob stagecoaches, and steal livestock. The notorious James Younger Gang, led by Jesse James and his brothers, became one of the most infamous examples of outlaw groups during this period. They robbed banks, trains, and even whole towns, leaving a trail of violence and terror in their wake. But their acts of defiance and rebellion were romanticized by some, who saw them as anti-heroes fighting against a system they viewed as corrupt and unjust. The lines between lawless criminals and folk heroes were often blurred in the public's imagination, adding to the mythos of the Wild West. As lawlessness spread, the need for order became more apparent. In the absence of formal law enforcement, towns often resorted to vigilantism, where individuals or groups took matters into their own hands. Vigilantes were often ordinary citizens, such as ranchers, miners, or settlers, who felt that the established legal system was too slow, inefficient, or distant to protect their interests. These self-appointed enforcers would organize to combat crime, seeking justice through extrajudicial measures. Sometimes this involved public hangings or shootings, carried out without the need for a trial or due process. The most famous example of vigilantism was the Lincoln County War, a violent conflict in New Mexico in the 1870s, where competing factions of ranchers and businessmen, each with their own interests and allegiances, took up arms against one another, leading to a series of bloody confrontations. In many cases, lawlessness in the West was tied to the presence of lawmen who were as tough, if not tougher, than the criminals they pursued. These figures became legendary in their own right, with their names and deeds becoming part of Western folklore. Lawmen such as Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok gained fame for their roles in establishing order in the chaotic frontier towns of the West. Wyatt Earp's involvement in the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881 is perhaps one of the most well-known moments of lawman legend. Earp and his brothers, along with Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton and McClory brothers, notorious outlaws. The gunfight itself, as well as the aftermath, which saw Earp and his allies pursued by bounty hunters, became emblematic of the challenges lawmen faced in an environment that was often hostile to official authority. However, the line between lawmen and outlaws was not always clear-cut. In the absence of law and order, the influence of both formal and informal power structures often led to corruption and injustice. Many lawmen, despite their legendary status, were accused of being involved in criminal activities themselves. Some turned a blind eye to crimes in exchange for bribes, or used their position for personal gain. Others, like Sheriff Pat Garrett, who famously killed Billy the Kid, were caught in the shifting loyalties of the frontier, where allegiances could change quickly, and the law was sometimes shaped by personal vendettas or political interests. In addition to the well-known figures of outlaws and lawmen, the lack of law and order led to the emergence of powerful and often corrupt political and economic elites. In boom towns where mining and cattle ranching were the primary industries, wealthy businessmen and ranchers often used their influence to control local governments and law enforcement, further complicating the legal landscape. They manipulated legal systems to protect their economic interests, often suppressing the rights of small farmers, miners, and Native Americans. In many frontier towns, those with the most money and resources were able to circumvent the law, while the poor and marginalized were left to fend for themselves. The consequences of this lawlessness and vigilantism were felt long after the frontier days had passed. The Wild West's reputation for violence, corruption, and the rule of the gun persisted in American culture, shaping the way the nation viewed its own history. The lawmen and outlaws of the West became the subjects of countless dime novels, newspaper articles, and later Hollywood films, which exaggerated their exploits and perpetuated myths about the nature of justice and heroism on the frontier. In these stories, lawmen were often portrayed as symbols of order and morality, while outlaws were seen as rebels who represented freedom, even if it was achieved through violent means. The Wild West struggles with lawlessness and vigilantism were more than just tales of crime and punishment. They reflected broader questions about the nature of justice and authority, and how communities could function without the formal institutions of law and governance. These issues of law, order, and justice were complicated by the diverse populations of the West, where different cultures, backgrounds, and values often clashed, and where traditional notions of law were challenged by the realities of frontier life. While the violent imagery of gunfights, bounty hunters, and masked outlaws continues to dominate our understanding of the Wild West, the true story of lawlessness in the frontier is far more complex, and it serves as a reminder of the fragile and often contested nature of order in societies on the edge of civilization. The Wild West was a land of stark contrasts, where dreams of opportunity met the harsh reality of lawlessness, and where the pursuit of justice often blurred the lines between right and wrong. It was a place where individuals took the law into their own hands, where outlaws became legends, and where lawmen were both heroes and flawed figures. This complex and tumultuous period of American history, marked by its violence, vigilantism, and the struggle for order, ultimately laid the foundation for the modern American legal system and societal structures. Though the lawlessness of the Wild West has become a captivating part of folklore and popular culture, its legacy reminds us of the ongoing challenges that come with the expansion of frontiers, both physical and social. The pursuit of justice in an uncertain world continues to resonate today, as it calls us to consider the balance between freedom and security, the role of authority, and the costs of progress. The Wild West may no longer exist in the form that it once did, but its lessons remain, calling us to reflect on how far we've come and how we continue to grapple with the pursuit of justice in an ever-changing world.